The Volantis Interstellar Academy had stood among the stars for 3,000 years, and it was the most famous school in the entire galaxy, where the children of powerful families came to learn and compete against each other. Students from 100 different alien species walked through its massive halls, and everyone knew that graduating from Volantis meant you would become someone important in the galaxy. The crystalline Vorath, with their bodies made of living gemstone, attended classes alongside the towering insectoid Kethra, whose armored shells could stop a laser blast, and the elegant Mindori, who could read thoughts and speak directly into your mind, studied next to the massive Gural, whose strength could crush metal with their bare hands. For thousands of years, humans had been alone on their little blue planet called Earth. But then they discovered faster than light travel, and suddenly they were not alone anymore, and the galaxy was full of ancient civilizations who looked at these newcomers with curiosity and doubt. The Galactic Concord was the great alliance of species that ruled most of known space, and after many years of debate, they finally agreed to let humanity join their ranks. But many aliens still thought humans were primitive and weak and not worthy of standing among the elder races. When humanity earned its seat in the Concord, they were granted exactly one scholarship slot at the famous Volantis Academy, and everyone wondered who they would send to represent their entire species. They sent Maya Chun. She arrived alone on a transport shuttle with nothing but a single travel case and a scholarship that barely covered her tuition fees, and she had no family connections to protect her, and no wealth to buy friends, and no diplomatic status to shield her from trouble. Maya was 17 years old, with dark hair tied back in a simple ponytail, and brown eyes that watched everything carefully, and she was shorter than most of the aliens around her, and she looked fragile compared to the armored and clawed and fanged creatures that filled the academy halls. The other students noticed her immediately, because humans were still rare in this part of the galaxy, and many of them had never seen one in person before. At first they treated her as a curiosity, and they would stop and stare when she walked past and whispered to each other in languages she did not understand, and some of them would approach her with questions about Earth and humans, and she would answer politely, even when the questions were rude. But curiosity quickly turned to contempt. Humans came from what the galaxy called a death world, because Earth was full of predators and diseases and natural disasters and extreme temperatures that would kill most alien species within days. But the aliens did not respect humans for surviving such a world. Instead, they saw humans as weak, because they had no natural weapons like claws or fangs or venom, and they had no protective shells or scales or thick hides, and they had no psychic powers or special abilities that other species possessed. Only things humans seemed to have were soft skin that cut easily, and bones that broke under pressure, and a strange persistence that made them keep going even when they should stop, and a body temperature so high that some aliens thought they were running a constant fever. Maya kept her head down during those first weeks, and she did not complain when students bumped into her in the hallways and pretended it was an accident, and she did not cry when she found her assignments deleted from the school computers, and she did not ask for help when her quarters were locked and she had to sleep in a storage room. She just kept going. Every morning she woke up early and ran laps around the station's gravity ring at hours when others were still sleeping, and her feet pounded against the metal floor in a steady rhythm that echoed through the empty corridors, and she ran until her muscles burned and sweat dripped down her face. The aliens who saw her running thought she was strange, because most species exercised in short bursts of intense activity and then rested. But this human girl just kept running and running at a pace that seemed too slow to matter. But she never stopped in classes. Maya sat in the front row, and she asked questions that made even the professors pause and think, and she excelled in theoretical physics, where her scores were among the highest in her year, and she showed a gift for xenobiology that surprised teachers who expected humans to be ignorant about alien life. But excellence made her more of a target, not less a group of wealthy students from the galaxy's oldest and most powerful families had formed a clique called the Galactic Consortium, and they controlled much of the social life at the academy, and they decided who was worthy of friendship and who deserved to be tormented. The leader of this group was Valith Sorain, a Mindori female, whose family owned trade routes across 3 sectors of space, and her pale blue skin seemed to glow within her light, and her large, dark eyes could look into your mind and pull out your deepest fears. Valith watched Maya-chan with growing irritation as the weeks passed, because this human girl refused to break no matter what they did to her, and she kept showing up to class, and she kept scoring high marks, and she kept running those endless laps around the gravity ring the consortium had driven away other scholarship students before with their campaign of small cruelties and social isolation, and those students had quit or transferred or simply given up. But Maya Shen was different. She would not leave. Valith gathered her closest allies in a private meeting room far from the ears of professors and administrators, and she looked around at the faces of her friends, including Krethuk, prime of the Kethra, whose massive armored body filled half the room, and Selenix Vera of the Varath, whose crystalline form sparkled but barely contained energy. Something more permanent was required. Valith told them, and her telepathic voice slid into their minds like a cold wind, and the human has proven resistant to our usual methods, so we must try something different. The others leaned in to listen as their leader explained her plan, and smiles spread across faces that were not human, and they all agreed that this would finally teach the human girl her place in the galaxy. Maya-chan had no idea what was coming for her, but even if she had known, it would not have mattered, because humans had survived ice ages and famines and plagues and wars that killed millions, and one girl trapped alone in the dark would find a way to survive. That was simply what humans did. Deep beneath the main levels of Volantis Academy, there were places that most students never visited, and these forgotten corridors contained the massive machines that recycled air and water for the 12,000 beings who lived on the station. Maintenance sublevels were a maze of pipes and conduits and humming generators that worked endlessly to keep everyone alive, and somewhere in that maze were emergency shelters built hundreds of years ago before force shields made such shelters unnecessary. These old rooms had walls thick enough to block all signals, including radio waves and telepathic communication, and they had been designed to protect people from disasters. But now they sat empty and forgotten and covered in dust. Valith Sorain knew about these rooms because her family had helped build the original station, and she had access to old blueprints that most people had forgotten existed. And she had spent weeks planning exactly how to use this knowledge. The invitation arrived in Maya's personal inbox 3 weeks before the most important examination of the year, and had looked completely official, and invited her to join a study group for the upcoming quantum mechanics test. Maya read the message carefully, and she recognized the names of the students who had supposedly organized this study group, and she knew that these were members of the Galactic Consortium, who had made her life miserable since she arrived. She knew it was a trap, but she went anyway. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was pride, or perhaps she was simply tired of running away from confrontation. But Maya-chan walked into the maintenance sublevel at the scheduled time with her study materials in her bag and her heart beating fast. In her chest, the corridors were dim, and the air smelled stale and old, and her footsteps echoed against the metal floor as she followed the directions from the message, and she passed rows of humming machines that nobody had maintained in years. She found a room, and she stepped inside, and for a moment she saw nothing but shadows, and then the lights came on, and she was surrounded. 6 figures stood in a circle around her, and their faces held expressions of cruel amusement, and Valith Sorain stepped forward with a smile that did not reach her dark alien eyes. "You actually came," the Mindori said, and her telepathic voice echoed inside Maya's skull. "And I must admit, I am impressed by your stupidity, little human. Maya tried to back toward the door, but something massive blocked her path, and she turned to see Krethek Prime standing behind her, and the Kethra's armored body was like a wall of chitin and muscle, and before Maya could react, one of his segmented limbs struck her from behind. Pain exploded through her skull, and her vision went white and then black, and she felt herself falling, but she never felt herself hit the floor. When Maya woke up, she was alone. The room was small and square with metal walls that seemed to absorb all sound, and a single dim light glowed from the ceiling, and the air was cold and stale and smelled like it had not been circulated in decades. She pushed herself up from the floor, and her head throbbed with pain, and she could feel dried blood in her hair where the Kethra had struck her, and for a long moment she simply sat there trying to understand what had happened. The door was sealed with a magnetic lock that her fingers could not open, no matter how hard she tried, and the walls were solid metal with no windows and no vents large enough to crawl through, and when she shouted for help, her voice simply disappeared into the silence. A screen on the wall flickered to life, and Valeth Serene's face appeared with that same cruel smile. The examination is in 72 hours, the Midori said pleasantly, and you will miss it. And you will miss the makeup examination too, if anyone even notices that you are gone. Maya stared at the screen without expression, and she did not give Valeth the satisfaction of seeing fear in her eyes. A human surviving alone for a week in a sealed chamber with no food or water. Valeth continued, and she laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a cold breeze. And even your species has limits, little human, and when we finally open this door, we expect to find you very weak, or perhaps not breathing at all. The screen went dark, and Maya was alone again in the silence. She sat there for a long time without moving, and she thought about her situation. And she calculated her chances of survival, and she considered all the ways this could end badly for her. Then she smiled. The aliens who had trapped her here thought they understood humans because they had read reports about human biology and human history and human behavior, but reading reports was not the same as understanding, and the consortium had made a terrible mistake. They had trapped a human in a box, and they expected her to wait quietly for death. But humans did not wait quietly for anything, and humans did not accept their fate, and humans did not give up simply because the situation seemed hopeless. Maya stood up slowly, and she ignored the pain in her head, and she began to examine her prison with careful attention, and she looked at every wall and every corner and every seam in the metal, and she studied the dim light above her and the screen on the wall and the sealed door. She was looking for weakness, and she was looking for opportunity, and she was looking for anything she could use, because humans were toolmakers and problem solvers, and they had survived every challenge their death world had thrown at them. The consortium thought they had eliminated a problem, but they had actually created one, because Maya-chan was not going to die in this room, and she was not going to simply escape and pretend nothing had happened. She was going to make them pay, and the first step was survival. 18 hours after they had sealed Maya-chan in the forgotten emergency shelter, the members of the Caliph Consortium gathered to check on their victim, and they expected to find a weakened human girl, perhaps already unconscious from dehydration and fear. Valeth Serene activated the monitoring system that showed thermal readings from inside the sealed room, and what she saw made her pale blue skin turn a shade lighter with confusion. The heat signature was wrong. There was thermal energy inside that room, far more than a single human body should produce, and the readings showed movement, constant movement that had not stopped since they had locked her inside. What is she doing? Krethek Prime asked, and his mandibles clicked together with irritation. Valeth did not answer because she did not know, and for the first time since she had planned this trap, she felt a small seed of doubt growing in her mind inside the chamber. Maya-chan had been very busy. The first thing she had done was take inventory of her resources, and she had found that she still had her academy uniform and her student identification card, and a small bag that contained her study materials, including a stylus and some notes and a hairpin that held back her hair. Most species would have looked at these items and seen nothing useful, but Maya looked at them and saw tools and possibilities and the beginning of a plan. The second thing she had done was examine the room itself, and she discovered that this emergency shelter had been built during an earlier era of the station's history, and it had been stocked with supplies that were meant to help survivors wait for rescue. Most of those supplies were gone or ruined by time, but Maya found emergency ration packets stuffed in a forgotten cabinet, and they were decades past their expiration date, and any other species would have refused to eat them. Maya ate them anyway. Human digestive systems were designed by millions of years of evolution on a death world where food was not always fresh or safe, and humans had eaten rotting fruit and raw meat and plants that would poison other species, and their stomachs could handle almost anything. The expired rations tasted terrible, but they contained calories, and that was all that mattered. The third thing Maya did was find a maintenance panel hidden behind a metal plate on the wall, and she used her hairpin and the edge of her student identification card to pry it open, and inside she found wires and conduits and circuits that had not been touched in decades. She also found something wonderful: an emergency beacon sat in that panel, covered in dust and forgotten by everyone, and it had been designed before the station was upgraded, and it was built to punch through exactly the kind of signal dampening that these walls provided. Maya did not activate it immediately. Instead, she sat down and she studied the beacon, and she thought about what she wanted to accomplish, and she realized that simply calling for rescue was not enough, because if she just escaped, then the consortium would claim it was all a misunderstanding, and their wealthy families would protect them from consequences. She needed to do more than survive. She needed to make sure everyone in the galaxy knew what had been done to her, and by whom. So she began to modify the beacon using skills she had learned in her engineering classes, and knowledge she had gained from her xenobiology studies, and the endless curiosity that made humans tinker with everything they touched. While she worked, she kept moving, because she knew that staying still would let the cold seep into her bones, and she did push-ups and squats, and she jogged in place, and she kept her body warm through constant activity. This was the human secret that the galaxy did not understand. Other species were faster than humans over short distances, and other species were stronger than humans in brief bursts of power, but no species in the known galaxy could match human endurance. Humans were persistent predators who had evolved on the African plains, where they hunted by walking after their prey for hours and days until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, and humans could sweat to cool themselves, which meant they could keep moving when other creatures had to stop and rest. The consortium had given Maya 72 hours, and they thought that was a death sentence, but Maya knew that humans had survived much worse with much less. She worked on the beacon for hours, and her fingers grew sore and her eyes grew tired, but she did not stop, and she wired the device to broadcast on multiple frequencies, and she connected it to the screen on the wall so she could transmit video, and she programmed it to send recordings to every system she could think of. By the 40th hour, she was hungry and thirsty and exhausted, but the beacon was ready. She could activate it now, and security would come and rescue her, and she would be safe. But she waited because the timing had to be perfect, and she wanted maximum impact, and she wanted the consortium to feel the full weight of what they had done. So she conserved her energy, and she rationed the remaining expired rations, and she did her exercises to stay warm, and she slept in short bursts, and she waited for the right moment. The quantum mechanics examination was scheduled to begin in a large amphitheater, where hundreds of students would gather and all the important professors would be present, and the timing would be perfect for what Maya had planned. She smiled in the darkness of her prison, and she felt no fear, only a cold determination that burned inside her chest like a flame that would not die the consortium had made. A mistake that many species made when dealing with humans. They had assumed that trapping a human meant defeating a human, but humans did not recognize defeat, and they did not accept impossible situations, and they did not stop fighting until they won or died. And Maya-chan had no intention of dying. She was going to walk out of this room, and she was going to destroy the people who would put her here, and she was going to teach the entire galaxy a lesson about what happened when you underestimated humanity. The beacon hummed quietly as it waited for her command, and Maya waited with it, patient and persistent and absolutely certain of her victory. 58 hours after Maya-chan had been thrown into that forgotten room, Valith Serene sat in the grand amphitheater of Volantis Academy, feeling completely satisfied with herself and her plan. The pre-examination review was about to begin, and 300 students from 40 different species filled the tiered seating that rose up toward the high ceiling, and the room buzzed with conversation in dozens of languages. Both spoken and telepathic. Professor Kentful stood at the front of the room, and the ancient Vorath scholar had been teaching at the academy for 400 years, and his crystalline body caught the light as he prepared to explain the finer points of quantum entanglement theory. Velith looked around at her friends who sat nearby, and she exchanged knowing glances with Krethik Prime and Selenix, Vio, and the others who had helped her trap the human girl, and they all shared a moment of quiet celebration. In just 14 more hours, they would open that sealed room, and they would find Maya-chan dead or dying, and they would express shock and horror and claim they had no idea how she had gotten trapped down there, and their families would make the problem disappear, as families like theirs always did. The professor began his lecture, and his voice resonated through the amphitheater as he described the mysteries of particles that could be connected across vast distances, and students took notes and asked questions, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Then every screen in the room flickered. The large display behind the professor went dark for a moment, and then lit up with a new image, and the personal tablets that students used for notes all showed the same thing, and even the emergency displays on the walls switched to this new broadcast. Maya-chan's face filled every screen in the amphitheater. She looked terrible, with dark circles under her eyes, and dirt on her face, and dried blood visible in her tangled hair. But her eyes were sharp and focused, and her voice was steady when she spoke. "Good morning," she said calmly, "and my name is Maya-chan, and I am a first-year student at this academy, and 60 hours ago, I was attacked and imprisoned in Maintenance Sublevel 7 Emergency Shelter 23C." The amphitheater went completely silent. 300 students stared at the screens with shock and confusion, and Professor Kentful stood frozen at the front of the room, and somewhere in the crowd, Valith Serene felt her blood turn to ice. I was left without food or water or any means of communication, Maya continued, and her voice carried through speakers that she had somehow connected to the station's internal network, and my captors expected me to die or become too weak to take my examinations, and they expected that no one would notice I was gone until it was too late. Valith tried to stand, but her legs would not obey her, and she felt the eyes of other students beginning to turn toward her as they recognized the guilt on her face. They forgot that humans do not die easily, Maya said, and they forgot that we survived ice ages and famines and plagues that killed millions, and they forgot that we crossed oceans on wooden ships and walked out of deserts that killed everything else that tried to cross them. She held up a device that looked like it had been assembled from scraps and garbage and wires, twisted together in ways that should not work, but clearly Dee built this from 60-year-old components. "And my own ingenuity," Maya said, "and it is currently broadcasting my location to Academy Security, and it is transmitting a full recording of my imprisonment to the Galactic Concord Human Embassy, and it is streaming live to every connected device." On this station, murmurs spread through the amphitheater like fire through dry grass, and students began looking around trying to identify who could have done such a thing, and the professors were already calling for security on their personal communicators. Maya's eyes seemed to look directly through the screen at Velis Serene. "Following students are responsible," Maya said, and her voice was cold and hard as steel. "And Velis Serene of the Mindori, and Krethek, Prime of the Kethra, and Selenix Vera of the Varath, and Tomius Krell of the Tirani, and Unith of the Shade Collective, and Brax of the Goral Hegemony in the amphitheater." 6 students tried to run Velith, pushed through the crowd toward the exit, but security drones were already descending from their stations near the ceiling, and their mechanical voices ordered everyone to remain calm and stay in their seats, and officers were on there. Wakerthig Prime tried to use his massive armored body to break through a wall, but more drones surrounded him, and even his incredible strength could not fight against a dozen armed security units. The other conspirators were caught within minutes, and they were forced to kneel on the floor with their hands restrained and their faces projected on the same screens that showed Maya Chun's broadcast to the Kellis Consortium. Maya said, and her voice rang through the silent amphitheater, "And I want you to understand something important, and I want you to remember it for the rest of your lives." She leaned closer to the camera, and her brown eyes burned with an intensity that made even the aliens watching feel uncomfortable. "You did not trap me in that room," Maya said, "and you trapped yourselves in a scandal that will end your academy careers and shame your families for generations, and create a diplomatic incident that your governments will spend decades apologizing for." She smiled, and there was nothing warm or forgiving in that smile. "We do not have claws," Maya said, "and we do not have telepathy, and we do not have armored shells or venomous spines or any of the natural weapons that other species possess. And what we have is spite, and glorious, patient, creative spite, and the absolute refusal to stay down when someone puts us there." Broadcast ended, and the screens returned to normal, and for a long moment, nobody in the amphitheater moved or spoke. Then security officers burst through the doors, and they were followed by medical teams who had been dispatched to rescue Maya Chen. And the chaos that followed would be remembered at Valantis Academy for centuries. Somewhere in the maintenance sublevel, Maya Chen sat in her prison and waited for the door to open, and she felt no triumph, only a tired satisfaction that her plan had worked. The door slid open and light poured in, and Maya stood up slowly, and she walked out of that room on her own 2 feet. And she did not fall, and she did not cry, and she did not show any weakness. A medical officer tried to help her walk, but she waved him away. She had survived worse than this, and she would survive whatever came next, because that was what humans did. The aftermath of Maya Chun's broadcast spread through the galaxy like a shockwave, and within hours the story was being discussed on news networks across 1,000 worlds, and everyone had an opinion about what had happened at Valantis Academy. The 6 members of the Calith Consortium were expelled before the day was over, and their families, who had spent generations building power and influence, found themselves suddenly facing consequences that their wealth could not buy away. Lyserene's family lost 3 major trade licenses that had taken centuries to acquire, and the Mindori government publicly condemned her actions, and her name became a symbol of shame among her people who valued mental discipline above all things. Kreth Prime was stripped of his warrior caste status and sent back to his homeworld in disgrace, and the Kethra did not tolerate those who attacked the weak through ambush and trickery, and his own people called him coward and honorless. The Varath, the Tirani, the Shade Collective, and the Goral Hegemony all issued formal apologies to humanity and to Maya Chun personally, and diplomats worked frantically to repair relationships that had been damaged by the actions of 6 foolish students. Criminal charges were filed under Galactic Concord statutes, and the trial was broadcast across the galaxy, and billions of beings watched as the evidence was presented, including Maya's recordings of everything that had happened in that sealed room. The Consortium Members were found guilty and sentenced to years of labor on rehabilitation colonies, and their families paid enormous fines that would take generations to recover from them, and their names were added to lists that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Maya Chun took her quantum mechanics examination unscheduled. Professors offered to let her delay the test, and they said that nobody would blame her if she needed time to recover. But Maya refused, and she walked into the examination hall with her head held high, and she sat down. As she completed the test, she scored highest in her entire year. The Academy's medical staff had wanted to keep her in the hospital for observation, but Maya had only stayed long enough to receive treatment for her head wound and to drink enough water to end her dehydration, and then she had discharged herself. Against their advice, she had a test to take, and she was not going to let the consortium take that away from her too. In the weeks that followed, something changed at Volantis Academy, and the change was slow at first, but it grew stronger with each passing day. Other students began approaching Maya in the hallways, and these were not the wealthy children of powerful families, but the quiet ones and the scholarship students and the members of minor species who had no political connections to protect them. They had all suffered their own small cruelties at the hands of students like the consortium, and they had all stayed silent because they thought there was nothing they could do. But Maya Chun had shown them that silence was a choice and that fighting back was possible. Study groups formed around Maya, and students who had never spoken to each other before began sharing meals and helping each other with assignments, and a community grew from the ashes of what the consortium had built. A Varath engineering student named Christex asked Maya to teach him how she had modified that ancient beacon because he had never seen anyone build something so clever from such limited materials, and Maya spent hours explaining the principles of human improvisation. A Cathro warrior named Dexkal asked permission to train alongside Maya in the gravity ring because he wanted to understand how humans could run for so long without stopping, and Maya welcomed him, even though his people had produced the one who had struck her down. Even some of the professors began treating Maya differently, and they asked her questions about human history and human psychology, and they wanted to understand how a species so young and so physically weak had produced someone capable of doing what she had done. Professor Kentful was perhaps the most affected by what he had witnessed, and the ancient Vorath had taught at the Academy for 4 centuries, and he had seen students come and go from every species in the Concord, but he had never seen anything quite like Maya Chun. He wrote in his personal journal late one night when the station was quiet, and his crystalline fingers moved slowly across the screen as he recorded his thoughts. Humans have been among us for only a single generation, he wrote, and already we are learning to fear the wrong things about them, and we feared their persistence and their endurance and their unsettling adaptability, but we should have feared something simpler. They do not accept defeat, he continued, and they do not recognize when they are supposed to die, and they remember everything and hold grudges with a patience that borders on geological, and they will wait years or decades or centuries to settle a score. The consortium thought they were teaching the human girl a lesson about her place in the galaxy, he wrote, and instead, she taught the galaxy a lesson about humans, and I suspect it will not be the last lesson they teach us. Maya Chun graduated 4 years later at the top of her class in 3 separate disciplines, and she had earned the highest honors the Academy could bestow, and she had done it while building a network of friends and allies from dozens of different species. She returned to Earth only once after graduation, and she spent a few days with her family in a small apartment in a city called Shanghai. And her parents cried when they saw her, and they told her they were proud of what she had become. Then she left again because she had work to do. The Varath Crystal Courts were the oldest and most powerful governing body in their sector of space, and they had never accepted a non-Varath into their diplomatic service, but they made an exception for Maya Chun, and she became humanity's first ambassador to their people at her farewell ceremony on Volantis. Academy, a young Mindori student approached her with nervousness written clearly on his pale blue face, and he was barely old enough to be attending the academy, and he reminded Maya of herself 4 years ago. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, and his telepathic voice trembled slightly in her mind. "And what they say about humans and that you never forgive." Maya looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the question carefully because it deserved a careful answer. "We forgive," she said finally, and she spoke out loud so that everyone nearby could hear. But we never forget, and we never ever stop moving forward." She smiled, and this time the smile was warm and genuine, and there was no anger in it. "That is the lesson," she said, and then she turned and walked toward the shuttle that would carry her to her new life, and she did not look back. The young Mindori watched her go, and he thought about what she had said, and he realized that he had just learned something important about the newest species in the Galactic. Concord humans were not the strongest or the fastest or the most powerful beings in the galaxy, but they had something that other species struggled to match. And it was not their endurance or their adaptability or their creativity. It was their refusal to be broken. Maya Chun had walked into a trap designed to destroy her, and she had walked out carrying a weapon made from garbage and determination. And she had used that weapon to change the galaxy's understanding of what humans were capable of. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, other humans were doing the same thing in their own ways. And they were proving that humanity belonged among the elder races, and they were teaching lessons that the galaxy would not soon forget. The Academy had tried to break Maya Chun, and instead she had taught them all a lesson they would remember forever. Humans do not break. They adapt, and they overcome, and they keep moving forward no matter what stands in their way. And that simple truth was more terrifying than claws or fangs or telepathy or any other weapon the galaxy had ever seen. And that was the lesson.